Welcome to our Euro-Atlantic Spot Series. Our topic today is drones, implications for national defense. And we're very fortunate here to welcome Michael Boyle as our speaker. Michael, welcome.
Thank you for having me.
Michael is an associate professor of political science at Rutgers in the United States, and he's also the author of a recent book that was published by Oxford University Press on drones. Could you refresh my recollection, Michael? What is the title of your book?
The title of the book is The Drone Age: How Drone Technology Will Change War and Peace.
Thank you very much, Michael. Now, I have a number of questions for you, but the first one is, do you own any drones?
I do not. I'd like to get one, though.
Okay. And now we'll go into the more substantive part of the interview. Why are drones important to national defense?
That's a great question. So drones are going to be a central plank of any 21st century defense for any government, really. And this is in part because we are fighting a different type of warfare that is increasingly information rich. Our governments want to know as much as they can about the battlefield. Equally, they want to be as precise and humane as possible. And so for these reasons, drones that provide really rich amounts of information about the battlefield are going to be essential to any government that wants to be able to compete in that kind of environment.
And what are some of the challenges that policymakers face that are posed by what I would call the drone age, or the advent of drones?
Well, there's a couple different challenges that I think are important. One is that we are moving from a very different world where traditionally the way we've thought about drones has really been driven by the US use of drones like Predator and Reaper drones in uncontested airspace, for example, in places like Pakistan and in Yemen. Increasingly, though, we're going to start to see drones being deployed in contested airspace, in environments where multiple actors, especially governments, are flying their own drones. And so that's going to require us to think very differently about how we think about drones. Another important element of this is that I like to say that drones are democratizing the airspace. And by that, I mean they're opening up the skies to actors that traditionally had a very hard time getting up into the skies, like, for example, non-state actors, like, for example, terrorist groups. And that is going to mean that a lot of governments that are confronting the reality of drone warfare are now going to have a degree of vulnerability from the skies from actors like terrorist organizations, like, for example, the Islamic State, that they had never had before. So you have a shift towards contested airspace, and you also have the democratization of the drones themselves and the airspace. And finally, I think we're going to see a real challenge around the integration of artificial intelligence around drones. And much of our discussion around this has been about whether drones will be responsible for kind of robotic forms of killing. But in fact, actually, the evidence suggests that that's not likely to be the case. What's more likely to be the case is that governments are going to turn to AI as a way of rapidly processing the amount of information that they get about the battlefield, so that they can act more precisely and humanely than they might have otherwise been. And so we're going to see AI be the kind of thing that changes the way that we use drones by allowing us to process information more quickly. That's far more likely than some of the scenarios we hear about how drones will be enabled to act entirely on their own through AI.
So, Michael, bottom line here, what would your recommendations be for policymakers?
Well, I have a couple of recommendations that I think are important. One would be to invest more in small and medium-sized drones, thinking more about drones themselves as a force multiplier on the battlefield. And increasingly, we're seeing that rather than using drones in uncontested airspace, as the US has traditionally done, we are seeing more and more governments use small and medium-sized drones to enhance the effectiveness of their ground forces in a contested airspace. The second recommendation would be to think a little bit about the distinction between manned and unmanned vehicles. Traditionally, we've kept them very separate as two distinct categories, but increasingly we're seeing technology that is, for example, a manned aircraft that can become an unmanned aircraft. So our defenses are going to have to think very hard about confronting threats that may have both manned and unmanned elements, and how we begin to think through the consequences of that change. And the third would be to invest in counter-drone technology. That in a world where more and more governments have drones, where drones are small and fast and lethal, we're going to have to think very hard about how to develop high-end technology that can both detect drones, jam them in the air, and interdict them safely so that they limit the vulnerability of our own forces.
Wrapping up, what is the bottom line here, the message that you want to send?
That future defense and future warfare is going to involve a very substantial component for unmanned technology, both in the air, but also on the ground and in the sea. And we have to think hard, not just about the technology, but how the use of that technology begins to influence our choices, our risk calculations, and even our goals as we interact and fight.